Hey, Prime members, you can binge all 10 episodes of Cold, ad-free on Amazon Music. Download the app today. This season of the Cold podcast includes descriptions of rape, sexual assault, murder, and domestic violence. Please, take care in listening. Cary Hartmann sat in shackles before Don Blanchard, a member of the Utah Board of Pardons and Parole.
Are you ready to go ahead with this hearing today?
I am.
That's Cary's actual voice.
I do need to place you under oath. I realize the restraints make it so you're unable to raise your right hand. I will still administer the oath and expect you to accept that. Do you affirm your testimony to be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
It was March 28, 2000, nearly 15 years since the disappearance of Cary's girlfriend, Sheree Warren, and 8 years since his first appearance before the parole board. Back then, Cary had denied having committed the rape that had sent him to prison.
Initially, there appeared to be feigned memory loss, problems in recalling events and what had transpired. That evolved into years of full denial that absolutely nothing had occurred, no sexual assaults whatsoever.
Now, with the prospect of parole on the horizon in just a couple of years, Cary was ready to take responsibility.
You think your victims enjoyed the sexual contact?
Absolutely not.
Don read an account of the crime into the record.
When she awoke, you were in the apartment, were turning off the TV, approached her, told her to be quiet, that you had a gun.
I won't share the graphic details. The important part is this. Cary, at long last and under oath, said it was all true.
Is that a correct summary of what happened in that particular incident?
Yes, sir, it is.
Cary had by that point served 12 and a half years on his 15 to life sentence. He had to do at least 15, but if the parole board believed he was sincere, they could let him out after that.
Reports suggest a number of other sexual assaults that were carried out by you of a similar nature. Is that accurate?
No, sir, I committed that rape. It's disgusting and terrible, but I didn't commit any more.
Cary's a bit tough to hear in this audio, but what he said was, I committed that rape, and it's disgusting and terrible, but I didn't commit any more.
Well, what about the other rape you pled guilty to?
That was one that I was charged with 4. And that was drawn out of a hat, quite frankly. And if I pled to it, they were going to drop the rest of them. And I did this on the advice of my attorney. He said, Cary, I don't think your mom and dad can live through any more trials. And they were ready to go to trial on the other 3. And he said, it's time to use your head instead of your heart.
Cary said he'd only pleaded guilty to the second charge on the advice of his attorney, to spare his mom and dad the stress of another trial.
I'll follow your advice.
You're asking this board to believe that you pled guilty to an additional first-degree felony, clearly aggravating your sentence in your jurisdiction, just because your attorney thought it was a good idea, not because you committed any other offenses.
He told me I was going down for a long time. He told me I was going down for life. And he told me 5 years with an additional rape won't make any difference in your case.
It does make a difference. And your honesty and credibility makes a difference too.
Yes, sir, I understand.
And it's seriously suspect at this hearing today.
Parole board member Don Blanchard wasn't having any of Cary Hartmann's denials. He wanted full accountability.
I'll ask you one more time. Were there any other sexual assaults that you committed?
I pled to that one, sir, because I did.
Were there any other sexual assaults that you committed?
No, sir, there were not.
Inside of relationships or outside of relationships?
Yes, sir, there were. In relationships I had, I used a forceful hand. I was abusive.
It's been a while since we talked about Cary Hartmann's marriages and the physical abuse his ex-wives described enduring. Cary waving it off as just a forceful hand undersells it. But Don was at a disadvantage here. The pre-sentence report provided to the parole board after Cary's rape conviction covered only that single case. Ogden police reports relating to the other rapes Cary was suspected of committing were supposed to be in the parole board's files, but weren't.
I know that there were some police reports available on those matters, but they weren't in our file.
I'm not sure if the Ogden police reports never made it to the parole board or if the board had misplaced them over the years. Whatever the case, Don hadn't read them. And that meant Don wasn't able to challenge Cary on the specifics of those other assaults.
Tell me how you feel about the impact your behaviors had on victims in your case.
I'm disgusted by it. I am so sorry for the pain and the suffering and the humiliation I've caused my victims, their families and my families. This didn't come to bear on me for a long time. I accept absolute full responsibility for my actions.
Cary said his actions were deplorable and disgusting, that he felt sorry for the suffering he'd caused his victims and his own family. He said he had been in ISAT for 10 years. ISAT was sex offender therapy. He had not been in that program for 10 years, not even close. As described in the last couple episodes, Cary had been twice booted from therapy over his behavior.
I made mistakes, I admit them, and I've grown from them and moved on. I was a taker.
Cary said he'd been a taker most of his life and had put on a ruse of being a good person while abusing people. Now, he said that was disgusting, but he said he had made great strides.
I think I made great strides lately, and when I mean lately, I mean the last years. I've done well in schooling, and I think I've shown that I can learn, and I think I've shown that I can move on.
Cary had presented the board with a stack of positive letters from relatives, friends, and clergy. He said he had job offers and housing at the ready if he were to be released. He would return to Ogden, he said, and complete outpatient sex offender therapy there. He just needed a stamp of approval from the parole board.
Do you also acknowledge, Mr. Hartmann, that you're a master manipulator?
I do, sir.
You acknowledge that you're trying to manipulate this board?
Into believing me, yes, sir. I do. I'm telling you from the heart, and I guess that's a form of manipulation. It's good manipulation.
This is Cold, Season 3, Episode 7, Purgatory. From KSL Podcasts, I'm Dave Cawley. I love listening to interesting stories, whether that's a podcast or audiobook. I'm currently re-listening to a favorite audiobook of mine. It's called The Last Season, and it's about a backcountry ranger who disappeared in the Sierra Nevada mountains of California. It's available on Audible, which makes it easy to listen anytime, anywhere. Audible has a huge selection of audiobooks across all genres, everything from mysteries to memoirs and more. As a member, you choose one title a month to keep from the catalog. New members can try Audible free for 30 days. Visit audible.com/coldpodcast or text coldpodcast to 500-500. That's audible.com/coldpodcast or text coldpodcast to 500-500 to try Audible free for 30 days. audible.com/coldpodcast. Hey, Prime members, did you know you could be listening to this podcast ad-free on Amazon Music? Binge all 3 seasons of Cold and other top true crime shows like Suspect, Morbid, and hundreds of others, ad-free with your Prime membership. To listen, visit amazon.com/coldS3. With Amazon Music, you get access to the largest catalog of ad-free top podcasts. Listen to your favorite shows without the ads, offline, on the go, or wherever life takes you with Amazon Music. Start listening by visiting amazon.com/coldS3. That's amazon.com/coldS3. Cary Hartmann had told the Utah Board of Pardons and Parole he had committed one rape and one only. Board member Don Blanchard hadn't believed him.
You absolutely are not here on you are not being dealt with on one single sexual assault.
Yes.
But Don hadn't known the full story. In Episode 5, we talked about how Reed Richards, the prosecutor in Cary's case, had told the 3 other women Cary had been charged with assaulting their stories would be available to the parole board even if they didn't go to trial.
All of that case material and all of the reports and so forth went down to the Board of Pardons.
But as I said a bit ago, the Ogden police reports relating to those other 3 cases weren't in the parole board's files. They had probably just been misplaced in the 8 years since Cary's first parole board hearing in 1992. But what matters is Don realized they were missing. He told Cary the board needed to find and review those reports before making a decision about whether Cary deserved to get out of prison. Don tracked the missing reports down in the weeks that followed. He read about Cary's lingerie survey phone calls, and all the women who had come forward after his arrest to report having been assaulted by Cary. Don realized he needed to talk to Cary again.
Hello,
Hi,
you're Mr. Cary Hartmann.
I am.
Cary was serving his time at the Iron County Correctional Facility, a jail in a town called Cedar City, almost 300 miles south of Ogden. Most parole board hearings occurred at Utah's 2 state prisons, but the board occasionally held hearings elsewhere, like at a jail called Purgatory, a little ways farther south of Cedar City. So that's where Cary once again went before Don Blanchard on July 28, 2000.
Mr. Hartmann, you understand why this hearing's being reopened today?
Yes, sir, I received the letter and the packet.
Okay.
For Cary to land back in front of Don just 4 months after their last meeting wasn't normal.
I'm concerned about the totality of your behavior and how many victims there have been,
Yes, sir.
and whether or not review of those reports, you suggested not being able to recall a lot of things. In fact, in these reports, back when the officers were dealing with you in the late 80s, you suggested struggling with your memory and having difficulties recalling things, and you would remember little pieces of information.
Yes, sir.
It's clear from the acknowledgments you made in these reports, you would only go so far in those acknowledgments and recollections and descriptions.
The Ogden police reports spanned hundreds of pages. I know because I've read them. And they paint a far broader picture of Cary's suspected activities during the 80s than even I've described in this podcast. Don had provided copies of those same reports to Cary.
You've had a chance now to read through those. What did that do to your recollection and your memory about this period in your life?
It brought it back in stark reality. It brought it back, and I read over them and through them 3 or 4 times. I was shocked at my behavior, but reminiscent of the person that was out of control.
Do you acknowledge additional sexual assaults?
Yes, sir.
Besides the
certainly
one
do.
rape you admitted to at the last hearing?
Yes, sir.
A remarkable and sudden improvement in Cary's memory.
How many sexual assaults do you estimate you've committed?
When I read through those, the 4 victims that I had, I recollected those, and I read through them and read through them and read through them, and there were much of that I recognized, and I own those. I'm responsible totally, absolutely, and I accept responsibility for that.
4 victims. Cary had gone from admitting none to 1 to 4. Exactly the number for which he had been charged, no more. And he had given up trying to blame those crimes on the other serial rapist, Blaine Nelson, who we heard from in the last episode. Don asked Cary about one of the other names contained in the police reports, not one of the 4 rape victims.
No, that wasn't one of them.
She was one that you made contact with through the lingerie surveys. Subsequently, she agreed to meet you for a drink. She didn't describe a rape, but she certainly described a sexual assault.
I do remember that, yes, sir.
Were you aggressive with her? And
Yes, sir, I was.
Did that unfold as she described it?
Yes, sir, absolutely.
There were others, like a woman named Jean. I'm not using her last name out of concern for her privacy.
There's one incident that dates back to '84, where a divorcee found your wallet out in the ditch bank outside of her house.
I did read that.
Had you been stalking her and watching her?
That's right. I don't have any recollection of that whatsoever. I lost my wallet once at the Deseret Gym, and it was stolen once, and I don't have any idea how it appeared there.
She described repeated incidents of having prowlers, hearing noises, seeing someone outside. Eventually she goes out to the ditch bank. She finds your wallet with your ID in it. She calls the police, gives them your name, tells them she has the wallet, probably even told them that she suspected you were prowling. Remarkably, the police never come and pick up the wallet from her. Years later, all of these sexual assaults are coming out. She goes to the drawer where she's discarded that wallet, gets it out, and turns it over to the police.
I read that.
Was she going to be a victim?
No, absolutely not. I just didn't do that. I just wasn't there. I just wasn't involved in that, sir.
Don remained unconvinced Cary was telling the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
I believe your memory was just as clear on those sexual assaults when I was talking with you in March and you denied them as it is today.
Yes, sir.
And that you admit absolutely only what is documented by records, and that there are probably other victims and other sexual assaults that you recall very well, which are not documented in the records. It appears that your life, probably for the decade of the 80s, was almost consumed by orientation, interest in sex and sexual activity, and that was what drove your existence.
You're absolutely right. You are absolutely right, sir.
But Cary said he was a different man now, that he felt regret every single day for what he had done. He said he was committed to working in therapy to overcome his insecurities. But even there, he found himself tangled, because sex offender therapy was no longer available where Cary was living. The Utah Department of Corrections only offered sex offender therapy at the state's prison. It had contracted with third-party providers to make therapy available at a few county jails, but the contract at Iron County had expired. That meant if Cary wanted therapy, he'd need to move to one of those other jails or the prison. He'd told Dawn during their earlier meeting he couldn't do that without putting his own life at risk.
I stayed in Iron County for protection.
What kind of protection reasons?
Being an ex-police officer, I stayed where I was at for those reasons.
Well, Mr. Hartmann, do you think you really have those kinds of problems?
I have in the past.
Cary's excuse of staying put for protection wasn't going to fly if he ever hoped to get a shot at parole. Dawn said he'd have to complete therapy.
All of your prior sex offender therapy and prior therapy up to now, if I understand correctly, it's dealt with your admitting to one victim. Is that right?
Primarily, yes, sir.
In my mind, that whole process has to start all over again.
I understand.
Cary's hopes must have dimmed in that moment.
Anything else you wish to say before this hearing's closed today?
I appreciate the board's indulgence. I thank you.
In the weeks that followed, the parole board members voted to keep Cary incarcerated. They said he couldn't get out until he disclosed all his victims. Listening back to these recordings from more than 20 years ago, I noticed something. In neither did anyone bring up the name Sheree Warren. A few episodes back, we met Ogden Police Detective Shane Minor. He had played a part in the search for the serial rapist who had terrorized women across Ogden in the mid-'80s. That's when he had first met Cary Hartmann.
We got quite a few calls once Cary Hartmann was arrested.
Some of those calls were tips from people who told Ogden police Cary might have killed his girlfriend, Sheree Warren. Shane had never met Sheree himself, but he had taken up her cold case years later in 1998.
Kind of started a new investigation, or started all over with it.
Shane had spent the better part of 2 years trying to track down witnesses, especially people who had known Sheree.
I started putting down names, and then I'd work on those when I had time, try to locate addresses.
Progress came slowly.
A lot of the interviews would be in the evening.
And off the clock.
No one's going to sign off on the overtime if it's not an active case that you're working, so...
Still, Shane had felt driven to do the work. The Sheree Warren case felt like a sliver under Shane's skin. The irritation of the unresolved mystery irked him anytime he brushed against it. He wouldn't feel right until the sliver came out, until he had solved the case. So Shane kept picking away at it.
It was very time-consuming.
He believed someone must have the missing piece that could lead him to Sheree's remains. But the passage of time complicated that.
14, 15 years go by, and you just start to forget.
In 2000, Shane left Ogden PD to take a position as investigator for the Weber County Attorney's Office. He remained a cop, but worked on behalf of prosecutors, making sure their cases were airtight. And he took the Sheree Warren case with him. Shane's notes mention a phone call he received that summer from Dawn Blanchard, the parole board member you've just been hearing. Dawn called Shane after talking to Cary because Dawn wanted to know more about Cary's girlfriend. Shane realized the board wasn't seeing the complete picture. It didn't know what he, Jack Bell, and other detectives had learned about Cary Hartmann's possible role in the disappearance of Sheree Warren.
And looking at all the information we had, there was a lot of information that was never provided.
Never provided because Cary hadn't been charged with a crime related to Sheree's disappearance. In the eyes of the parole board, Cary's crime was sexual assault, not murder. And even when it came to the sexual assault,
every chance he had, he denied doing anything. He was wrongly convicted. He'd never done anything. So that was his take on it. And then later on, he finally started to admit what he was convicted of. But he didn't admit to anything else other than that information that he knew he could have been charged with.
Shane suspected Cary Hartmann had killed Sheree Warren, but suspicion wasn't enough. He needed to prove it. The simplest way would be to get Cary to confess.
But he was already looking at life sentences on what he'd already done.
Cary had no incentive to admit to killing Sheree if he had done it, so Shane couldn't count on a confession. The next best proof would be to find Sheree's remains, perhaps in a place Cary had visited in the days after Sheree's disappearance, the mountain behind Causey Reservoir.
But that's such a vast area that you described.
Shane thought he had more time. Dawn told Shane it'd be a few years yet, but Cary would go before the board again. If he had completed his therapy by then, he'd likely win parole. Dawn said if all else failed, Shane could ask the parole board to hold what's known as an evidentiary hearing. That's a formal meeting focused on evidence. Any evidence, not just about the rape cases. Shane could then tell the board members anything he had learned that might tie Cary Hartmann to Sheree Warren's disappearance. Shane wanted to keep Cary incarcerated as long as possible, both to protect the public and to buy more time for his investigation. He believed Cary still harbored secrets about Sheree Warren, but he was running out of options on how to get answers. For investigator Shane Minor, the prospect of Cary Hartmann winning parole added a ticking clock to his search for the remains of Sheree Warren.
All of the problems along the way of just sitting down and working on this and staying focused on this.
He knew if he didn't push for answers about what had happened to Sheree, no one would. Shane had talked to Roy Police Captain Jack Bell about his May 1987 conversation with an elk hunting guide named Fred Johns.
Okay, so who is Fred Johns?
I've mentioned Fred a few times before. He's the guy who had reported seeing Cary on the mountain behind Causey Reservoir the Sunday after Sheree disappeared.
I knew Fred Johns from the Ogden area.
Fred had a reputation as a pool hustler and a gambler. Shane had heard Fred was prickly about police. He wasn't sure what to expect when he tracked Fred down in April of 2001.
Fred was living up in Mountain Green and went up and talked to him about the statement he had made to Bell about seeing Hartmann in early October of 1985, just to lock that down for the report.
Fred died in 2019, so you're not going to hear from him in this podcast. What I tell you next comes from Shane's formal report and his own personal recollection of their conversation.
He basically went through that same story that he went through with Bell.
That story went like this. On the Sunday following Sheree's disappearance, Fred was on the ridge between Causey and Lost Creek reservoirs. Think back to our percent sign. Causey in the upper left, Lost Creek in the lower right, and a mountain between them. Midway between the two reservoirs, on top of the mountain, is where Fred Johns said he saw Cary Hartmann.
And recalled seeing him that first week in October. I believe it was the first week of the elk hunt.
The land belonged to a family of sheep herders named the Wilds, and it was some of the best elk hunting ground in the western United States.
Wilds was the people's last name that owned the property that leased the hunting rights to Johns.
In other words, Fred Johns paid the Wilds for exclusive access to their property during the elk hunting season. Fred would then turn around and market his services as a guide. If hunters wanted to bag an elk on the Wild property, they had to first pay their dues to Fred. Or trespass and risk having an armed and irate Fred Johns chase them off the mountain. Fred jealously guarded the Wild property during the hunt. He would spend those weeks in September and October living out of a shack on the mountaintop.
He would charge people to come in. He ran like an outfitters up there and do these guided hunts up on that property.
Fred also parked an RV a few miles from his shack. On the opening weekend of the '85 elk hunt, Fred was driving the dirt road between the shack and the RV when he noticed something. Tracks in the dirt he hadn't seen the night before.
Then he ran across Hartmann and somebody that he thought was his brother up there.
Cary Hartmann with his pickup truck, a pair of three-wheel ATVs, and another man on the mountain just 4 days after Sheree Warren's disappearance. Cary only had the one brother, Jack Hartmann. Jack had stood in the police lineup with Cary before the rape trial, along with their look-alike cousin, David Hartmann. This was not a case of mistaken identity. Fred knew Cary.
He knew Hartmann from high school, I believe, and I think he even told me that they lived together for a short period of time, so he knew Cary Hartmann.
Way back in episode 1, I mentioned how Fred had kicked Cary out of his house after Cary came on to Fred's wife in the mid-'70s. Fred didn't deny that bit of bad blood when he talked to Shane Minor, but it didn't seem like reason enough for Fred to fabricate this sighting of Cary on the mountain.
Told me how he had seen him in the afternoon.
That, to me, would seem pretty suspicious.
Yeah.
Fred told Shane he had stopped, stepped out of his truck, and asked Cary what he was doing there. Cary had allegedly said he had gone down off the ridge to the north, toward Causey Reservoir, looking for elk. Fred had been skeptical of this because, as I said, he had driven by that same spot earlier and had not seen Cary's truck there. Fred told Shane precisely where the sighting had happened.
How he referred to it was the right-hand fork of the Gildersleeve Canyon.
The spot Fred described was at a clearing where the dirt road passed by the heads of two canyons, one to the north, the other to the south. Shane wanted to see it for himself, but he couldn't just drive up onto that property without permission. It was privately owned, deep in the mountains, and protected by gates.
After I talked with Fred, I asked him if he would take me up and show me exactly where it was he seen him, and he agreed to do that. So it was sometime later when the snow allowed.
The ridge Fred described sits at just over 8,000 feet above sea level. Winter drapes that mountain with deep snow every year. Some years, the snow might thaw by the end of April.
But you're usually going into the end of May or June before you can get up there and access a lot of that area.
That's how it was in the spring of 2001. Shane wasn't able to go up with Fred until the end of May.
He took me up where he had access to the property right there by Lost Creek.
Remember, this was more than 20 years ago. Shane didn't have a GPS unit to track the journey. He had to rely on a more primitive technology, the odometer.
I kind of identified it off of mileage.
I've compared Shane's mileage notes against maps and confirmed the precise spot of the Fred Johns sighting. The route Shane took to get there is probably not the same one Cary Hartmann would have used on that Sunday in October of '85, if Fred Johns' information was correct. There are several other ways to get up onto that ridge, including from Causey Estates. Cary had at least 3 friends who owned property in Causey Estates. And remember, in episode 4, Cary's friend Brent Morgan, the taxidermist, told us he had loaned Cary his key to the gate at Causey Estates that fall.
And even that Lost Creek area, which I think Lost Creek, there's 2 or 3 different places that you could have access.
I know it's difficult to picture this without seeing it on a map, but Causey and Lost Creek are on opposite sides of the mountain. Again, they are the 2 circles in the percent sign. Cary could have potentially gained access from either side.
Could have gotten around the gate and gotten onto that property. Could have accessed it.
There's a dirt road that crosses over the mountain, connecting the 2 reservoirs. And it's on that road Fred Johns said he saw Cary. But between the 2 reservoirs,
you got thousands and thousands of acres up there.
It's the kind of place where, if you had enough time and determination, you might hide a body and expect no one would ever find it. That's why Shane needed to go to the precise spot where Fred Johns said he had seen Cary Hartmann.
He showed me the area where he was backed in at and where he had talked to him.
The ridge at that spot is only 100 or so feet wide, with canyons falling away on either side. Shane poked around, hoping to stumble upon something that might convince the parole board Cary Hartmann was guilty of more than just sexual assault.
We'd heard that Pro was coming up. There was a lot of information. I got thinking about it.
Like the forensics of human decomposition. The tissues that make up a human body break down after death. The speed of that breakdown depends on the climate, whether the body's buried, and so on. Eventually, a body will reduce to nothing but bones, and those bones will come apart, a process called disarticulation. So Shane didn't expect to find Sheree Warren's complete body, or even her skeleton. He knew if Sheree had been left on the mountain, after more than 15 years, he would be lucky to find even a few small scattered bone fragments. But then, maybe he didn't need Sheree's body itself. Something as simple as her earrings or necklace might suffice, and those wouldn't decompose. Shane also knew Sheree's purse had never been found. And of course, there remained the question of the two coats. Cary Hartmann had repeatedly said Sheree had left his apartment on the morning of her disappearance wearing his black parka. Sheree's mom, Mary Sorensen, believed Sheree had left her house that morning wearing a gray suede jacket. Police had found the gray suede jacket in Cary's apartment, so if Shane were to find Cary's black parka on the mountain, it might suggest Cary had wrapped Sheree's body in the coat before dumping her there. But luck didn't shine on Shane that day. No bones, no necklace, no parka. He didn't find anything. Shane Minor wasn't the type to give up easily. He decided to call in the Cadaver Dog Cavalry.
Made arrangements with Wally Hendricks, who was with Duchesne County Sheriff's Office.
Wally Hendricks was at the time the top search dog cop in the state of Utah.
He had had some success on finding some bodies, so I contacted him.
Wally mustered up 7 dogs and handlers, all of whom drove to meet Shane early one Saturday morning in June of 2001. Their trucks rattled up the route Fred Johns had shown Shane. The back of Shane's truck was packed with enough soda, chips, and sandwiches to feed a Little League team. But instead of aluminum bats and leather baseball gloves, the coolers were flanked by shovels and mesh screens. Shane came prepared to sift for bone fragments if the dogs caught whiff of a gravesite.
We hit that hillside with the dogs just to see if we could kick anything up, but again, that was 15 years, 16 years after the fact.
Shane didn't dare hope, but he stood by and watched as the dogs worked down from the ridge.
They kept going, so I think we went off the top and went down into that canyon, and they went quite a ways down in the canyon and did a pretty diligent search. I felt bad because they're volunteers and they're doing this on their own, just trying to help out. But we put a good day's worth of work up there with those dogs.
But once again, Shane came up empty. Sheree Warren wasn't within a stone's throw of the spot on that mountain ridge. I've had the opportunity to observe a few different cadaver dog searches in my time as a journalist. Nowadays, both dogs and their handlers wear GPS tracking devices when they search. This allows investigators to come back later and verify the precise locations checked and see any gaps in the coverage. There are no GPS tracks like that for this cadaver dog search of the spot on the mountain between Causey and Lost Creek. And that's a problem now, 20-plus years later, as I try to piece together exactly where the dogs went. Would that have been down into Gildersleeve?
I believe so.
If the dogs only searched to the south into Gildersleeve, they might have missed the mark. The canyon to the north is called Pete Nelson Hollow. I've talked about it before. Pete Nelson Hollow is where the lost hunter from the 1940s, Rudolph Bertinoli, wandered down through a snowstorm and ultimately died. Bertinoli's bones had remained there 43 years before being found. Cary Hartmann could have traveled into Pete Nelson Hollow on his three-wheeler. And if so, a cadaver dog search down the opposite direction into Gildersleeve would have been pointless. This show is sponsored by BetterHelp. So I was driving down the road the other day when I saw a little cat on the sidewalk. She appeared to be in distress, but couldn't exactly ask for help. So I got out, I checked her over, took her to the vet. And it turns out, yeah, she really did need help. But I was there. I had her back. None of us can get through life entirely on our own. It's important we have people in our corners, like, say, therapists, who can listen and provide helpful advice when we are in distress. If you're thinking about trying therapy, consider using BetterHelp. It's entirely online and works around your schedule, making it convenient and flexible. Discover your potential with BetterHelp. Visit betterhelp.com/cold today to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/cold. I enjoy hiking, just getting out into the wild to clear my mind. But I'm not always the best about keeping my body in hiking shape. I find it's easy to indulge a bit too much. Then I hit the trail and feel the literal weight of those indulgences. Don't let anyone ever tell you how you should feel about your body. Your weight is your business. That said, if you personally would like to recalibrate your relationship with food, look into Noom Weight. It's an app and service built around psychology. It can help you understand the science behind your cravings, and awareness of the why is a key ingredient to building healthier routines. Stay focused on what's important to you with Noom Weight's psychology-based approach. Sign up for your trial today at Noom.com/cold. That's NOOM.com/cold to sign up for your trial today. And check out Noom's first ever book, The Noom Mindset, a deep dive into the psychology of behavior change, available to buy now wherever books are sold. I'm standing on the tarmac at the Morgan County Airport, south and east of Ogden on the backside of the Wasatch Mountains. It's late September of 2021, and wildfires across the western U.S. have filled the air with smoke. A motor engages behind me, lifting a hangar door to reveal a collection of single-engine airplanes. One of them, a little white and blue two-seater with a bubble canopy, belongs to my dad. I've been coming up to this airfield in the town of Mountain Green since I was a kid. My dad always seemed to know everyone here.
How are you? You getting ready to go fly?
Yeah.
Good. It's beautiful up there. The colors are gorgeous. So are you heading
Through the haze, I can make out a blast of red and gold draped across the eastern slopes of the Wasatch Mountains. Autumn leaves are at their prime. But we're not out to admire the scenery today. We're on a mission to take a look at the canyons behind Causey Reservoir.
Yeah.
You met my son Dave?
I don't. Probably when you were a lot smaller.
Yeah.
So yeah, have a good time. You are doing awesome with your reporting and stuff. Really, yeah.
We roll the plane out of the hangar and fire up the engine. The idea of inspecting the land around Causey from the air isn't mine. I stole it from retired investigator Shane Minor.
You don't like flying so much, from what I understand.
No.
But Shane took to the air 18 and a half years on from Sheree Warren's disappearance, and 3 years following the failed cadaver dog search, still hoping he might find some sign of her on the mountain behind Causey Reservoir. On the morning of May 24th, 2004, Shane and a fellow investigator named Rob Carpenter, along with a state trooper named Stan Olson, took off in the Utah Department of Public Safety helicopter.
It was a very pleasant flight. The pilot did a wonderful job, was a great guy, but too small of planes for me, or helicopters.
They headed east, following the South Fork of the Ogden River. They crossed over top of the Meadows Campground, the place Cary Hartmann had tried to meet Heidi Posnine way back in 1971. Then the chopper crossed over Causey Dam. It banked to the right.
Okay, this is the road we want to follow right here, right?
Yes, I believe so.
Yeah, this Causey Estate's up here.
A video camera recorded the flight as the chopper followed the dirt road south from the dam into Skull Crack Canyon, over the gate that blocks the way into Causey Estates.
Now you call this is Causey Estates up here? That's what that's called?
Yes, it's private landowners that have it.
Pretty.
The chopper climbed, following the slope of the mountain.
This would have been the road that I think he had access to. So, I mean, there's unlimited places where he could have dumped her along here.
Hard to think like a bandit, you know. Would you have picked a characteristic turn or a rock or tree or something as a landmark?
Shane snapped photos out the window as the helicopter crested the top of the mountain south of Causey. It turned east, crossing over Box Spring, the place where the taxidermist Brent Morgan had had his wedding in 1984, a year before Sheree Warren disappeared. The chopper followed a dirt road that snaked along the top of a ridge. It approached the place where Fred Johns, the elk hunting guide, had said he had seen Cary Hartmann.
It's got to be right up along this road here, about a mile, right around in there.
The place Fred said Cary had taken his three-wheelers the Sunday after Sheree Warren disappeared.
Hey, Rob, does this look about it right over here off to the right?
Picking out a specific place from the air can prove really difficult.
Then where would we have gotten the dogs out? That's my question.
But after a moment of confusion, Shane recognized the spot.
Yeah, I think this is it right here off to the right.
That little clearing there?
Yes. He backed in by that piece of snow right there. That's where he was seen at, and then he took off and went back out the same way we came up and wasn't seen again.
Investigator Rob Carpenter had also been there on the day of the cadaver dog search.
When we came up here with those dogs, there was elk sign everywhere on this drainage right here.
They weren't expecting to find Sheree Warren's body on this flight, because scattered bones would be all that remained after so many years. Those would be too small to see. Instead, they were documenting the various routes someone could have used to reach the site on the ridge back in October of '85.
Could you get in from that Croydon side without a key?
No, it's gated off on that road that goes up to Lost Creek.
Oh, okay.
Nowadays, you can do a lot of this kind of work using high-resolution aerial imagery, available for free on the internet. But when it comes to investigations, there's no replacement for putting your own eyes on a place.
So we got it documented. It was a smooth day. It was a great flight.
And hovering in a helicopter over a remote mountain forest
There's some elk down there.
does bring some fringe benefits.
Boy, that elk disappeared real quick. Didn't like the helicopter, huh?
I think the pilot knew that I was a little nervous about it, so he went out of his way to make it comfortable.
Now, Shane, be honest, you okay?
He's fine.
Okay. He's taking pictures of the elk. Boy, there's a whole bunch of them. Look at them all down there. Oh, yeah. Beautiful country up here. Wow.
Beautiful. And practically impossible to search.
Just because of the amount of land up there.
Thousands and thousands of acres, incised with canyons and cliffs, choked with thick brush, known to only a select group of herders and hunters. Much of Utah's mountain land is national forest, open to the public. But this mountain between Causey and Lost Creek reservoirs is private, mostly owned by two neighboring ranches, Deseret Land and Livestock and what was formerly known as Basin Land and Livestock. Hunting those ranches today is a pay-to-play experience, limited to just a handful of weeks each year. Someone can't just go exploring for a body up there on a whim. When Shane had taken cadaver dogs on that mountain, they had centered their search at the site pinpointed by their witness, the elk hunting guide Fred Johns.
I was putting a lot of faith in those dogs, and if something had been dumped, hoping that it wouldn't be too far down in, and if we were in the right location, and if we come up with a bone or something.
We hit this whole side of the hill here, a couple 100 yards in both directions, and worked down towards the bottom of this, to what would be kind of logical to drag a body. Just hoping to hit a bone or something, but never came up with nothing. After he was seen, now, he could have drove back out and dumped her any place.
Yeah, moved her, whatever.
A bit earlier, I mentioned not knowing exactly where those cadaver dogs went. Shane's description here of a couple 100 yards suggests they didn't go far. But again, when Fred Johns first told Detective Jack Bell about seeing Cary Hartmann at that spot the weekend after Sheree Warren disappeared, Fred said Cary had been loading up his three-wheelers. Three-wheeled ATVs were all the rage during the 70s and 80s. They were especially popular among hunters, who could use them to pull their kills out of the woods. A mule deer and a human can weigh about the same. So it stands to reason, if a three-wheeler can pull a deer out of the brush, it might also be capable of moving a human into it.
If you got off that dirt road and used some type of an SUV to get down in those canyons, it'd be like worse than looking for a needle in a haystack, unless you knew exactly where that was.
Pete Nelson Hollow, the canyon that drops to the north from the spot on the ridge, runs 3 miles before reaching the Right Fork South Fork Ogden River behind Causey Reservoir. It'd be tough to get a three-wheeler all the way down there, but taking a body even a quarter mile or so off the dirt road would significantly decrease the chance of anyone stumbling across it.
Unless you're right on top of it, I think it's going to be really easy to miss.
Shane's helicopter flight in 2004 had achieved what he had set out to do. He had photographed the points of interest on our percent sign: Causey Reservoir, the cabins of Causey Estates, the dirt road running the slash of the percent sign over the mountaintop, and Lost Creek Reservoir on the far side. I wanted to go one step further. That's why I asked my dad to take me up in his plane, all these years later. I wanted to not only see the landscape for myself, but also ask, if I were trying to hide a body in this corner of the world, where and how exactly would I do it? I've flown over this landscape now 3 times. Once in KSL's helicopter, Chopper 5, and twice with my dad.
There's Causey Estates.
Yep.
Flying over that mountain is about the only way to put eyes on the area without driving, hiking, or horsepacking across miles of rugged, privately owned mountainside.
This road we're crossing over,
Yep.
would be the one that he would have used.
I've spent more hours than I care to admit studying maps and aerial images of the Causey area, trying to memorize the landmarks, working out possible routes for a three-wheeler, thinking about where someone might have dropped a body.
Okay, so that's the spot, right? We just flew right over top of where they said he was parked.
Okay.
So he would have gone potentially down the canyon to the left. So can we circle around here?
Right here.
The upper reaches of Pete Nelson Hollow are covered in stands of quaking aspen that explode like fireworks during the fall.
Oh, that's remarkably pretty.
Yeah.
There are a couple of springs right up top here. One of the things I noticed looking at the topographic map is there was at one point, a little ATV road that went down to those springs.
There's a path that cuts through the trees, leading into the upper reaches of Pete Nelson Hollow, about a quarter mile from where Fred Johns reported seeing Cary Hartmann.
I'm curious if you could get a three-wheeler down there. I'm thinking you definitely could.
Oh, yeah.
I came away from these flights believing it's plausible Cary Hartmann could have hidden Sheree Warren's body on that mountain behind Causey Reservoir. And I believe Shane Minor's cadaver dog search more than 20 years ago probably missed the mark by sticking too close to the road. The evidence suggests Cary Hartmann could have used an ATV, a three-wheeler, to move Sheree's body to a concealed spot on that mountain, just far enough out the cadaver dogs couldn't find it. But any good hypothesis deserves to be challenged by experiment. Which means before our season's done, I'll need a three-wheeler and access to the mountain behind Causey. The Utah Board of Pardons and Parole scheduled Cary Hartmann for a rehearing on September 20th of 2005. It had been 5 years since the back-to-back hearings you heard at the start of this episode, where Cary had bombed his chance to take accountability. During those 5 years, Investigator Shane Minor had expended a lot of effort, but made little progress in his search for the remains of Sheree Warren. Shane knew the information available to the board didn't include the circumstantial evidence linking Cary to Sheree's disappearance.
It was just the individual rape cases, and that was it.
Because again, Cary hadn't been charged with a crime connected to Sheree's disappearance, let alone convicted of one.
And we have this information that would indicate he's done a lot more than what he's been charged with, and it's stuff he's never come clean with.
Cary had cleared the significant hurdle of serving 15 years on his 15-to-life sentence. He stood a good chance of at last winning parole. Reed Richards, the prosecutor who had put Cary in prison, told me he'd anticipated Cary would only serve the minimum, 15 years.
In fact, that was the time where they had mandatory incarceration and mandatory length of stays. And so that was very unpopular with the prison, of course, that you had to mandate how long they stay. And so they generally would look at that minimum time, and that's when they cut people loose.
Cary had done enough time to qualify for release, unless the parole board decided it had good reason to keep him in. Under Utah law, the parole board wields broad authority. The board has the ability to consider more than just the crime that sent a person to prison when deciding how long that person should remain in custody. Shane believed the parole board had a blind spot in Cary Hartmann's case.
There's just a lot of information that started to come out that I felt maybe the board should be aware of that.
With 5 days to go before Cary's rehearing, Shane Minor sat at his computer and started to type. "I have hesitated writing this letter," he began, "because I know there is nothing you can do. But at the same time, I feel compelled to at least provide you with information concerning Cary Hartmann." Shane went on to summarize the story of Sheree's disappearance. He explained his role in the Ogden City rapist investigation back in the 80s. He described how publicity of Cary's arrest in that case had led to a flood of tips, including some about Sheree. But, he wrote, Cary was by that time in custody, represented by counsel, and unavailable for questioning.
He never answered any questions about his relationship with Sheree when asked about it. He only volunteered what he wanted Jack Bell to hear at the time she disappeared, and that was it.
Shane wrote about how he and Detective Chris Zimmerman had dropped in on Cary at the San Pete County Jail following his conviction, in the hopes of asking him about Sheree.
Zimmerman and I went down in '88 after he had gone to prison, just to see if he had talked to us about that, and he wouldn't talk to us, got up and walked out of the room.
He explained how over the course of nearly 20 years, investigators had talked to multiple jailhouse informants who had claimed to have heard Cary making incriminating statements. But none of it had ever led them to a body. The investigation is continuing at a slow pace, he wrote. He stopped short of asking the board to take any specific action, but concluded by saying, quote, "I felt this is information that you should be aware of." He signed his name at the bottom and sent the letter to the Utah Board of Pardons and Parole.
Are you looking to straighten your teeth, but the thought of monthly dentist visits or a mouthful of metal has you rethinking it? Transform your smile with Bite Clear Aligners. Bite Clear Aligners are doctor-directed and cost thousands less than braces. Skip the traffic to the dentist and straighten your teeth from the comfort of home. Bite has had over 250,000 people use their clear aligners already, and they have both daytime and nighttime options depending on what's most convenient for you. Plus, their MyBite app can help you track your alignment progress, do check-ins, and connect with us at any time. Visit BYTE.com to order your at-home impression kit today for just $14.95 using code WONDERY. Start your clear aligner journey with Bite. That's code WONDERY to get your impression kit for just $14.95.
Shane Minor's letter found its way into the hands of a man named Kent Jones.
My name is Kent Jones. I work as a hearing officer with the Board of Pardons.
Kent conducted Cary Hartmann's 2005 rehearing at the Central Utah Correctional Facility, a state prison located in the town of Gunnison.
I think this is the first time you've been in front of a hearing officer, but it's basically the same as if it was a board member.
They went through the formalities.
Cary, I have your prison number as 18553, correct?
Yes.
Okay. Cary, I'm going to be reviewing kind of the life and times of Cary Hartmann in a few minutes, and then I'd like you to respond to some of the questions I have. So I need to place you under oath. If you would, raise your right hand and I'll swear you in. Do you swear or affirm the information you're about to give?
Kent summarized the crimes for which Cary had been charged and asked if Cary admitted to them. Cary said he did. Kent gave Cary an opportunity to make a statement.
I'd like to turn it over to you for a few minutes.
Cary used the time to talk about how out of control he had been in the years before his arrest. He said it had started with financial problems and a sense of pride that had kept him from asking his father for help.
The more I strived
to put my finances together, he said, the deeper in the hole I got.
I used pornography.
I used pornography and masturbation to try and climb out of a hole, to make myself feel better. It didn't work. From there, he said he had tried to regain control by seeking out, quote, lonely and vulnerable women. I stalked them. I broke into their homes. I followed them. And I sexually assaulted them.
How did you meet these women?
Sometimes I saw them in a dance club or a private club and followed them home. Kent noted this candor was a significant change, since Cary had for so long insisted on his innocence.
Cary, why have you waited nearly 20 years to talk about this? Are you getting tired of the time? Are you just coming to grips with some things? Why did you put on this facade for so many years when your mom and dad were struggling to protect you? Even religious people would swear to their deaths that you were innocent. Is it just kind of coming to a head now?
I was in such denial.
I lived in such denial. I thought I couldn't be a bad person, and I couldn't do this. And I convinced people, and I manipulated them, and I coerced them into believing. Cary said that had changed once he had decided to approach treatment with an earnest heart after his last parole hearing. He had left Iron County, where he had lived for more than a decade, and transferred to another jail in far-flung San Juan County. The move had allowed him to once again enter sex offender therapy. He still had 8 months to go in the program, but he said he was on track to graduate. His disciplinary record had improved. No more pornography. No more dirty audio tapes. He was working as head cook in the jail's cafeteria. If granted release, he said, he would move back in with his parents, who were by then 80 years old, and get a plumbing job in Ogden. Kent expressed some hesitation with that plan.
I guess I'm concerned about the long history of sexual deviance, even prior to when your arrest. Wasn't there some indication you were doing some telephone obscene stuff years and years before that?
Yes, sir, I was.
I was involved in making unsolicited phone calls at random. I called up women and made sexual comments and sexual innuendos over the phone.
How did you come up with those names?
Just at random in the phone.
In the phone book?
Yes, sir.
Okay.
Kent pointed out other troubling details from Cary's records.
That's where we come to some of the other concerns. According to here, you may have been doing a lot of wife swapping. On one of your honeymoons, you brought a prostitute to the room to have her do a threesome. On another occasion, when you was in San Diego area, you brought a young Marine to have him have sex with your wife while you watched.
Cary didn't deny the allegations made by his ex-wives, for the most part.
You liked violence while having sex?
I wasn't a violent person, but I was a violent person.
I wasn't a violent person, but I was a violent person.
I was abusive.
I was abusive, and I hit them, and I'd slap them, and I'd push them. But I wasn't a violent person during sex.
Well, it's kind of interesting that you're saying you're not violent, and then you just tell me that you are hitting them. Now, that's violent, isn't it?
Yes, sir. I wasn't a sexually violent person.
I wasn't a sexually violent person, but I was abusive. Yes, sir. Absolutely. Cary had admitted to entering women's homes and forcing them into sex by threat of violence. He'd admitted to physically battering his wives. But if we're to believe him here, he was a gentle lover. Kent didn't let that slide.
So could you consider some of your ex-wives as being victims?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Kent rattled off the names of Cary's ex-wives and former girlfriends, asking one by one about the details of what he had done to them.
Did you put a 357 to her head and try to have her have sex with your friend?
I remember having a gun in the drawer, bringing it out, and waving it around. I don't remember putting it to her head.
I don't remember putting it to her head.
She says that's what happened.
If she said that's what happened, that's what happened. Cary at one point tried to dodge one of these questions by saying, I think anyone that was involved with me when I was in my sexual deviancy is a victim. And although no one said it then, I'll point out Sheree Warren was involved with Cary Hartmann during his, quote, sexual deviancy.
How about a woman by the name of Jean? Have you ever heard her name before?
I haven't.
That's not true. Jean's name had come up during Cary's prior board hearing in 2000, the hearing you heard at the start of this episode.
I think she'd reported that she saw a prowler outside her window. She went out and found your wallet by the window. Do you recall losing a wallet when you was doing some window peeking years ago?
I do, sir.
Do you know who you was watching?
No, sir.
I think her name was Jean.
It's a small detail in the grand scheme of this story, but in that earlier recording, you heard Cary insist he had lost his wallet at the gym, saying he had no idea how it had ended up outside Jean's house. So either he'd been lying then, or he was lying now.
What I'm trying to do, Cary, is I think that there's a lot of other victims there that you hadn't previously disclosed. Do you see where I'm fishing, what I'm trying to do? Aren't there others there? You're an intelligent guy. I think you got 121 IQ. You're not dumb. You're a brilliant guy. It just seems to me, Cary, you're not really being honest with me.
Cary pushed back, saying he hadn't before considered his ex-wives as victims, but everything else he had disclosed in therapy. He had no other victims to report. Kent had one other name to ask about.
I come up with another name when I'm researching this, and I can't retry your case. I'm not a prosecutor, but I want full understanding of everything. So I was in contact with a Weber County official because I wanted to figure out this one name, Sheree.
Yes, sir.
And I guess I'm a little concerned about that. That was a girlfriend of yours in 1985. She disappeared and has never been seen since. They think you have somehow been involved with some foul play with her disappearance. At the time, they sought your help and you tried to look for her. And it wasn't until after your arrest, I think in 86 or 87, that they started thinking that maybe you were connected with it. Many years later, they asked you, but you adamantly denied talking to or didn't want to talk to him, and you walked out of an interview. And I guess I'm concerned about that, Cary. I just wonder as to whether or not she's dead somewhere, and you had anything to do with her death or her disappearance. And I would imagine that officials might be looking at this to reopen it as a cold case murder investigation to see if you're somehow involved with it. Are you willing to talk to some of the law enforcement officials about her disappearance?
Well, absolutely. I had nothing to do with it.
I had nothing to do with it.
Did you have an argument with her on the night she disappeared?
Absolutely not. She disappeared from Salt Lake City and I was in Ogden.
She disappeared from Salt Lake City and I was in Ogden.
I was surrounded by people the whole time.
I was surrounded by people the whole time, morning and night, until I reported it. Interesting, Cary said he reported Sheree missing because that's not how it happened, at least according to Detective Jack Bell's notes. They say Sheree's mom, Mary Sorensen, first reported her missing. Then Jack Bell called Cary, not the other way around. It was a subtle shift in the story, but no one challenged Cary on it. Cary told parole board hearing officer Kent Jones he just wanted a chance to be the good person he knew he could be out in society. Kent promised the board would take it all into account.
You've done an enormous change from 5 years ago, disclosing a lot of different things that you've done, but I just don't know that you're completely honest yet. And I would encourage you to talk to the Weber County people. If in fact they think that you are involved with her disappearance, it might be to your best to be just as honest as you possibly can with them, because I get the information from this investigator that they've got a lot more on you than what you think. Okay? Good luck, Cary.
Investigator Shane Minor received a cassette tape in the mail days later.
I talked with Ken Jones, who was the hearing officer. Then he sent me a copy of the hearing.
Shane listened to the tape with great interest.
In that hearing, Hartmann admitted to the cases he was charged with.
Did you, in fact, rape her?
I did.
Okay.
According to Hartmann, he was more than cooperative with law enforcement regarding Sheree Warren.
My whereabouts were documented.
My whereabouts are documented. I'm the person that reported her missing. I worked with Detective Jack Bell for over a year and a half trying to look for her.
But then he would only refer to Jack Bell, his contact with Jack Bell. He forgot to mention the fact he wouldn't talk to us about her. So Jones kind of put him on the spot and says, so you're willing to talk with law enforcement about that?
Cary, I would encourage you to talk with any of the Weber County people that might come down and talk to you.
And he said he would.
Cary had had a little other choice. Defying the Board of Pardons would likely mean serving a maximum sentence.
You've already got a life sentence on you. And if you hope for any release in the future, whether it's now or 20 years from now, my guess is it's better that you attempt to disclose that now instead of trying to do what you've done in the past and lived under a cloak of deceit.
And so, 20 years after Sheree Warren's disappearance, Cary Hartmann would finally face a formal interrogation about the night she disappeared, thanks to some pointed prodding from the Utah Board of Pardons and Parole.
I think it was because of that is the only reason he agreed to talk with us.
Shane Minor, who had helped finger Cary as one of the 2 Ogden City rapists, had a date with a man he suspected of Sheree Warren's murder. On the next episode of Cold.
Did you have good relationship with your brother at that time?
No.
You did not?
He changed. He was like 2 people.
Do you remember if Kevin Sullivan, as your brother's attorney, ever advised you not to talk to the police?
He might have. I don't know, maybe I'd speak honestly and he didn't want to hear it.
Hey, Prime members, you can binge every episode of Cold ad-free on Amazon Music. Download the Amazon Music app today. Or you can listen ad-free with Wondery Plus in Apple Podcasts. Before you go, tell us about yourself by completing a short survey at Wondery.com/survey. My special thanks in this episode to Utah Board of Pardons and Parole Records Officer Allison Tormundson and the staff at the Utah State Archives. They patiently and persistently worked with me for 2 years to locate all of the parole board audio you've heard in this podcast. This part of the Sheree Warren story couldn't have been told without their help, and I'm thankful for it. If you have information about the disappearance of Sheree Warren, now is the time to share it. You can reach me by emailing cold@ksl.com or contact the Roy City Police Department at 801-774-1063. I also want you to know, if you've experienced abuse or sexual violence, you're not alone. There are trained experts ready to listen and help. In the United States, survivors of rape and sexual assault can connect to free resources through the Rape, Abuse, and Incest National Network at rainn.org. If you or someone you know is experiencing domestic abuse in any form, you can reach the National Domestic Violence Hotline at thehotline.org. Cold is a production of KSL Podcasts and Wondery in association with Workhouse Media. Cold is researched, written, and hosted by me, Dave Cawley. Audio production and sound design by Ben Kiebrick and Aaron Mason. Mixing and mastering by Ben Kiebrick. Michael Bonmiller composed our main theme, with additional music this season by Allison Leighton Brown. My personal thanks to our editorial team, Amy Donaldson, Andrea Smarden, Ryan Meeks, Becky Bruce, Kira Faramond, Kellyanne Halverson, Josh Tilton, and Felix Bennell. For Amazon Music and Wondery, managing producer Candice Manriquez-Wren, producer Claire Chambers, senior producer Lizzie Bassett, and executive producer Morgan Jones. Special thanks to Cale Bittner and Allison Vermeulen. With Workhouse Media executive producers Paul Anderson and Nick Piniella. And for KSL Podcasts, executive producer Cheryl Worsley. For pictures and more, go to our website, thecoldpodcast.com, and follow us on social at The Cold Podcast. Most of all, thank you for listening.
What are you saving up for? A vacation? A remodel? Or just because saving is a smart thing to do? A CD from Sandy Spring Bank gives you time to grow your savings at a guaranteed rate. Right now, you can earn interest at 4.25% annual percentage yield on a 14-month CD or 4.00% APY on a 35-month CD. Ready to grow your savings? Let's talk. Visit sandyspringbank.com/CD specials. Minimum opening deposit is $2,500, member FDIC.